The children are all good. Everyone is well. We just had the Lacan conference, so I've
Oh,
got
how'd
all
it
of those.
go?
It went well. I enjoyed it. I tried to present on thinking Dante's Paradiso and kind of the principle of where Beatrice tells Dante, "Hey, if I smile too early, it will destroy you." And it's very interesting because it suggests that in heaven you can turn it into hell instantly if you don't wait for light, is the phrase. So he refers to the problem with Lucifer is that he didn't wait for light so that his eyes could handle it. And I think for me, it's sociologically very interesting because it suggests that human beings need a certain waiting for light. Like if you hit them with something too soon, it kind of overwhelms them and different things like that. So we were talking about that. Oh, and Alex Ebert, it is good to see you today, sir. I hope you are doing well. And everyone, I really liked how Alex has connected in his work with the idea of with the status anxiety, bringing that together also with a kind of static drive, and that we tend to define status relative to what's static. And I think that's very, very true. So I really appreciated that work. But no, I think if we take seriously the idea that there's this kind of art of unveiling, likewise, the reason that's kind of relevant for Lacan is because if you expose people to the real too soon, it kind of overwhelms them and they have a pathological response. But then if there's a certain timing, who decides what that timing is? Couldn't you be kind of almost like patronizing, looking down at people and being like, oh, they're not ready? So that could be a problem. But then there's also a wisdom. How do you discern the amount of the real or kind of that people can handle? Like a thing I think about, then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak, is that there's a lot of talk today, like I've been talking with people about the commodity form, kind of sociology, where people are like, well, we need to relate to one another other than market forces, right? We need to relate to people, make Forrest Landry will talk about care. We need to talk with one another in terms of a commons or a community. Well, this is very tricky because when you go through, in my opinion, when you look at various anthropological accounts, I'll mention Louis Dumond, I think you can do Tocqueville. Turns out that when you leave people alone, unmediated, without something like markets to mediate their responses, they tend to kill each other, or they tend to be miserable. There's kind of two great myths that define, I'll even say maybe you could say capitalism versus various forms of communism or socialism. The myth of capitalism is that free markets, if you make them entirely free, take care of themselves. That doesn't seem to be true. You need to have a state to come in and regulate the business cycle. You could talk about Cole, Planier, and different things like that. But the other kind of myth is that if you leave people alone in an unmediated space, they get along. They kind of operate and they find new bases by which to operate. When really what ends up happening is people, they become uncomfortable with one another, they avoid one another and things like that. Well, if that's the case, and there's this idea of talking about new commons or new grounds of relationship, then those are kind of, you can't fall into the ditch of either of those myths. There's some other way of bringing people together that seems to require a certain gradualness, a certain level of unveiling, training. I know you've done so much with Luke over at Parallax on this idea of training people for things of the real. I think about also Javier was talking about sex and the disappointment of sex. There's also an art of sexuality that's overlooked where people instead just expect it to kind of work magically, but instead there's a kind of training. And we don't really have, it's almost like you don't have a civilization that thinks in terms of training. It's a civilization that thinks good, bad. And that's the logic of Inferno in Dante. But once you start moving into the Paradiso, which I think first world nations, wealth, prosperity aligns with, then you're talking training. There's a funny line in kind of Dante where literally it's like joy will kill you. If you're not ready for joy, it will actually kill you. Ecstasy will kill you. There's that tradition of beauty piercing, ecstasy kills, things like that. It's just if you enter intimate relationships and you're not ready for them, they can destroy you. They can turn into hell. Some of people's worst experiences happen in family or marriage or things like that. So that's what I was thinking about. And I think a lot of that, if you take that seriously, transforms how you go about relating to people and how you think about talking to people. There's some sort of art form that's there, but we can talk about anything. I throw it to anyone who'd like to speak.
You know what immediately comes to my mind, Daniel, is surprises. I think the danger that you're talking about, or at least the danger that kind of associated to me immediately, was we think we know the language that we might want to use when we say we want to belong. And so I think we should not, this is not to say that we shouldn't have a mediation, but this is to say that it might be better off knowing that we don't know what that mediation is and let it surprise us. Or maybe there's a way to disguise the mediation and let us be surprised about it, about the fact that maybe this is how I would like to belong, or feel belong, or relate to other people. Because I think the issue might be is how we kind of paradoxically work against ourselves. You know, we're always sort of setting things up to expect a kind of belonging. But of course, the surprise is that always works. That doesn't happen. But what might interest us is, what is it that might surprise us about how we can belong, versus always explaining it away. And I think we're very tempted to explain it away. But surprises can tell us two things. It can tell us, one, I didn't expect that. And the other part was, I didn't know I was expecting. I didn't know I was expecting that. But I don't know. Those are just things that come to my mind when you were talking about this.
I like that phrase, I didn't know I was expecting, because I think that happens in relationships a lot. When things don't, you were like, no, I don't have any expectations. I don't have certain ways that I think things should go. And then they don't go, and you're like, that's wrong. And it's very interesting how we carry out particular activities to convince ourselves we don't have expectations when we do, or we convince ourselves that we're good with surprise when we're not. And how there's something about that realization where you're kind of deconstructing your own mechanisms of self-deception, that seem really critical to be the kind of person that can handle surprise. Because it's almost like what Ibu on this kind of idea of this kind of static drive. It seems like self-deception is one of the main things it's in service of is precisely creating a certain stagnancy. Like you self-deceive yourself to believe that you're not static, that you're actually quite agile when you are not, because you're never putting yourself in the environment. Like surprise always has to be, it would seem to me, surprise always has to be other. It always has to be environmental. Like if you plan to be surprised, well, then the surprise is probably just going to already be absorbed into your imaginary and symbolic registers, right? It's already going to be absorbed into your ideas. And Clayton and I were talking with Guy last night. It's just like the problem of like empathy. Like everyone talks about empathy now. I'm very empathetic. But really, I do wonder if empathy is possible if it's not surprising. Like if you plan to be empathetic, then you have to think about how you're going to be empathetic and what it would mean for being empathetic to the other person. And so you tend to do it in a manner that is already sort of comfortable relative to your ideology, or that does not demand so much of you. So what's interesting is it would almost to me suggest that empathy requires a kind of surprise. It requires a certain sort of bam. And then in that surprise, you find out what kind of person you actually are. Because now you're forced to, we were talking last night too on the idea of, you know, there's a theological tradition of the notion that you can't know God by his essence, only by his effects. I wonder if that's actually human beings in general. Like we only know ourselves by our effects, not by some kind of essence. Like when we look for the true self, we just kind of go crazy and it becomes static by definition. But really, we find out what we are by our effects. And those effects are what happened in the surprise with the other person, that then we find out what we really are. And there's a kind of effect that comes out. And then that's where we see what we're really like. But if we talk about like plan, I'll give it to Clayton here. But when we say plan to be empathetic, or even people will say, you know, be, and then I'll give it to Mr. Sweeney, is like, and then be intentional in different things. Well, frick, the moment you're intentional, you define what that looks like, right? And you start kind of fitting it in to something. So it's very interesting. Like in order, it would almost suggest if to really think in a sense, you have to get to outside of yourself, then the only way to think is to create certain environments or certain situations where you can be surprised. Like everything else is just going to fall within your plans or fall within your self-created enclosures. But let me give it to Clayton and then Mr. Sweeney. Clayton, please.
What was speaking about with Guy yesterday, it's like you have to. Yeah, I don't think you shouldn't plan. I think you should still plan, but you shouldn't hold your plans too strongly. Like have a plan, but have some flexibility to allow room for the plan to, you know, evolve and for the plan to adjust with whatever is emerging. Because the plan has to be flexible, but there's also, like, without a plan, you probably are going to end up in a situation where you're too frightened to even engage because you don't know how to, how do you take a step, right? How do you take a step if you don't know where the ground is, right? But at least you need an idea of where you can take the step. However, you may not know if the step is going to hold you once your foot lands there, and that's the element of surprise. And I think being open to that surprise, like Javier was saying, it's like it can't be real if you plan where you're being surprised, because then it's more just an execution of the steps. It's like, oh, I'm just going to step here and I'm going to step there, and I just tiptoe my way through this minefield, if I may say. But then it's just performative, and there's no resonance for you. And it still reminds me of that, you have to be adjusting to what it is you're relating to as you relate to it. So you have to give that allowance that you don't know the things that you're bringing and the biases that you're bringing in and the assumptions you're bringing in. You don't know the effect they have on the thing that you're bringing them to. And so if you come in with the presumption that you know what that is, then it definitely ends up seizing up, right? And you see this a lot in misunderstandings and argumentation. You have people clashing over what they really hold true. It's like, I really know what I'm talking about, and they're trying to call you out for whatever you're saying not being true according to their definition of what true is. But by making that claim, it's at the same time a claim that they really know what the truth is, and I don't know if they really do. So, so the conflict arises from that assumption. But like we were saying yesterday, it's through the revelation, right? Like revealing your reality and how it's hitting you, that can offer an invitation to, a shared point of contact, right? It's through revealing what it is you're touching, then, that example about the elephant, like which part you're touching of the elephant and what it feels like, what it's shaped like, then that can be sufficient to sort of like offer the other a way to come into your experience, and then they can reveal their side, and then there can be an opportunity for that resonance, that shared point of contact. I just wanted to share those few thoughts. Thanks.
No, I appreciate it. I'll give it to Mr. Sweeney. Mr. Sweeney, I saw you raise your hand, and then I'll give it to Javier. What's interesting there is on this idea of a point of contact of something that is kind of outside of yourself, not reducible to your plans, and yet it is leading you all the same, right? And it's interesting too, because I guess I'm thinking like on this idea of, they always say know yourself. It's almost like what you need to do is event yourself, like create events in which things occur that surprise you, and you find out if you're able to keep your hand around that elephant tail, right? Like there's a lot of talk of process and event, kind of the event breaking through. It's almost like, because the reason why I think this is important is because we have this problem now of talking about new sociological conditions, new communities, and so on and so forth, right? And there's this idea of the problem of unmediated spaces overwhelming people. There's some sort of skill, some sort of abilities that people need to be able to handle that, right? Well, maybe it's because what we need to do in the same way that like if you host people or you create an art exhibition or you create a space, you're kind of an event manager, right? It's almost like instead of talking about knowing yourself, what we need to do is talk about eventing yourself, like creating spaces where events can occur. But this is tricky because a lot of people, they say, well, that's why I travel. That's why I go and gather experiences. But what's tricky is you plan those experiences. You have preset ideas on them, right? So then traveling can just kind of serve the ideology or your preset idea. So how do you, it's like this trick of how do you event yourself, right? And that's when you know yourself. And if you have a society of people who are all eventing themselves in this way, that seems to suggest possibility of alternative ways of social relation or community. But I'm thinking now like event yourself versus know yourself. But let me pass it to Mr. Sweeney and Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Sweeney, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you have been well.
Yeah, we're starting our Gurdjieff course next week, so this is maybe the last Thursday I might be able to jump in here and talk to you guys.
Well, thank you for being here
for the next 3 months. Well, I was thinking when you first started talking about how you get burned by Beatrice's smile, burned by heaven, so to speak, by experiencing heaven, and then I was tying that into, you know, what I was studying in Dzogchen teachings. They talk about how we move from our problematic situation, how we get involved in our problematic situation, and that is by affirming an identity and affirming a home and affirming it's like the ultimate non-dual teachings are there is no identity, there is no home, and and then our concepts about ourselves are wrong, right? So we create these false concepts about. So I was thinking about, when you have that early love experience and you get burned by Beatrice's smile, it's a sense of like, this feels like home, but it's not home. I also saw Alex here, so I was thinking of his song Home, and I was thinking of this love song where you feel like you're home when you're somewhere, and then but it's not home. It's not really home. It's not ultimate home. And so you get burned by that realization. And also that in the ordinary mystical, like ordinary religious traditions, they're always warning you, like, don't look at the burning bush, don't experience that. But we do experience it, and we do die when we have those experiences. And we have to go, there's a way in which when you get to the mystical path, it's actually more about allowing yourself to die when you face that and experience that heaven hell duality as one in a sense. So anyway, those were just some of the thoughts I had.
No, I think that's magnificent, Mr. Jochen. It's good to see you, and Tyler, good to see you as well. I'll pass it to Javier. Well, it's very interesting. Like, one of the things we've been talking about with Lacan is the problem where desire requires a kind of partial object in order for the desire to keep kindling. If you get the object of your desire, it kind of dies. And what's interesting in these kind of religious traditions of the notion of don't look at this thing that you know that's there, that thus creates the desire to know it, or there's this unveiling of the smile. There's a kind of keeping desire alive, not by creating an object that doesn't exist, that's a kind of illusion, but by having an object be something that can only be unveiled gradually, which in that very gradualness transforms the subject in ways that they otherwise would not be transformed to handle more of the object or more of the glory, right? And I think a lot of mystical traditions are kind of tied to this. I know Sutra, Sankhya, all these kind of ideas of unveiling, or Matthew Stanley was talking about the esteric versus the exoteric. This notion of unveiling the esteric, the mystery or the deeper truths in a gradual manner so that they don't overwhelm people, but then at the same time train the subject to be able to handle more of it, right? And you see, it's kind of like also, I guess, on this idea of eventing yourself, not just knowing yourself, creating events. How can you create events for yourself that something is unveiled to you so that you can handle more of those mystical truths or those deeper truths or those more difficult things? That the problem is you don't know them, right? So, and if you know them, well, then they can't have this quality of the partial object that is unveiling in a manner because you already know the whole thing, right? And thus it can't train you because you already possess it. Like, that's the thing. Like, once you possess something, it can't really train you anymore because you have it, right? It's the thing that is denied to you to some relative degree that can then train you. But if it's denied to you too much, well, then you don't even know to seek it. So it's this interesting dilemma. And then it would seem like, if we're talking, again, new community, new commons, new sociology, you need a society of providing these kind of experiences for more and more people so that they can handle different subjectivities to relate to one another outside of, say, a commodity form, market forces, all the stuff that people talk about, right? And that seems to be some sort, you're basically at that point almost talking about some sort of widespread unveiling training, mystical training of the difficult.
But this is combined with the shock. So there's the oscillation between the gradual training and then the fact that you have these sudden shocks to your system, which you also have to deal with as well, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
I think there's a sort of oscillation between shock and gradual sort of deepening and
Absolutely.
understanding.
No, I think about when that Christiansburg 4-time state wrestler picked me up and slammed me into the mat, and I was shocked by how easily he did that. But it was a kind of shock that inspired me to get better, not the shock that made me say, why do I even try? So it's interesting on how do you have then subjects able to handle shock in a manner that pushes them forward versus deconstructs them entirely. But you're right, you got to handle that shock. But let me give it to Javier and then Mr. Ebert. Mr. Javier.
Hey. When you were talking about how do we get people to, I guess, embrace the more eventfulness, the event themselves? The question that came to my mind was, how do we get them interested in failure? Because we seem very disinterested in failure. And when we talk about failure, it always has like a kind of hopeful alternative to it, which is a very fine line to do, because to me, it's less about succeeding after the failure and more about the keep trying part, right? Or another way of saying it is, I'm really interested in better sentences. There's no success in that. I'm just really interested in better sentences. The other thing is, I started thinking about Freud's understanding of dreams. And when Clayton was talking about, well, we need to still try to plan, but leave room for a kind of opening. Freud kind of talks about this with dreams. He talks about how there's the manifest dreams and then that kind of space that has nothing in it, that has just blank. He goes, that's a part of the dream. That's a part of the dream, which I find really fascinating, because it means there must be something in our dream life or in the working of our dreams in our daily life that has that space for it. We just don't realize it. But we could perhaps counter it in our actual dreams. And to me, the way I interpret that notion of the event that you're talking about, Daniel, is exactly that space for failure. That I don't know what that is. It's just a blank space. But I'd prefer not to interpret that, and I'd prefer to avoid it. But I think when we do that, I think we find ourselves really ambivalent about truth. Is that we say we want it, but really we don't want it. Which is the kind of Hegelian point, right? Like failure is about, if you really were adamant about the truth, you wouldn't be so deterred by failure, which I also find really interesting. So maybe it's not about being, or maybe we should be, maybe we should make the interest go from truth instead to truthfulness. And that might be a way to embrace the partial object that you're talking about. Because being truthful doesn't mean that you know the truth. It just means that you might not know. And that's a kind of partial acceptance of it. I'm just being truthful about what I don't know, or what I think I might know. So I think that might be a way. And I think maybe if we get people more interested in just being more truthful about what we're doing and what we think we're doing when we're actually doing something else. But yeah.
I like this emphasis. I'll pass it to Mr. E, but emphasis on interpreting the failure of the blank space. It's interesting because in society, we tend to focus on the success. We try to interpret the successes. We try to talk about what you're good at. We ask people, what are you good at? Because that's what you should do with your life, right? We don't ask, what are you bad at? That's what you should do with your life. We don't ask about, what did you skip in the dream? We don't ask, and it's very interesting because something like this seems to be what is required of individuals to be able to handle less mediated spaces, whether it be in terms of capital, the state, it doesn't matter. And a lot of times, the reason a lot of times people say, if we could just get the state out of the way, everything would be great. If we could just get the market out of the way, everything would be great. It depends on you're conservative or liberal, right? I think looking, if you take my word for it, it seems looking at history, that's not true. You can't merely get something out of the way. You have to offer something positive, if you will, of people to make them able to handle that space. But the funny thing is, the positive thing you need to offer seems to be failure, actually. Like the thing you need to give them is a space to fail and to event themselves, not giving them like it's a partial object of some kind that you give people that then seems to be the things that kind of mediate them. And I think the idea of like focus and then another way to put it is if you're going to create global pluralism, you need some kind of what the sociologists will call an abstract social norm. There has to be an abstract principle that we all socially agree on that's a kind of norm, not oppressively, but I can talk to you about it in a manner that's intelligible, right? And it's not reducible to just an object I own, but it's a way of being toward the world. Like the commodity form is a way of being toward the world. I see things as potential prices. Forrest Landry talks about care, being toward things in terms of love or care. These are towardness, right? So these are abstract social forms. So you have to have a new abstract social form if you're going to make people relate. And what's very interesting is it seems to have a lot more to do with getting people to interpret and face failure than it is talking about what they're quote unquote good at. So it just made me think of what you were talking about. But let me give it to Mr. Alex Ebert. Mr. Alex Ebert, how are you doing today, sir?
Good, thank you. I don't know. I'm going through some sort of like rebellious phase, I think. So I'm just like, what are we talking about? You know, are we all life coaches here? Like, what are we literally all? Do we all make our money life coaching? Is that what? Am I in like a life coaching, like how to coach life coaches as life coach sort of club? Is that what's going on? How to get people to accept failure and these sorts of things. It's like I just noticed in the last like yesterday in the philosophy portal too, it was just like the conversations just keep coming back to like, how do we help people? How do we fix this? How do we fix this? And very often it's about like, well, we want to fix it, but also make it broken so that it can be fixed by people. So you have a sense of overcoming. And we want an obstacle, but not a hard obstacle. But we do need an obstacle to overcome, but not a hard obstacle. We want the obstacle to be engaged in the game in such a way that the obstacle allows you to transgress it on a sort of intentional level. So you want a father figure who's like strict, but also knows that the father is there to be killed. You want the law that knows that it's there to be broken and so on. But what fun is the game if you know that the law is there to be broken and eventually it's going to let you break it? Exactly what have you accomplished? Isn't it much more fun and a sense of accomplishment to think that the law was there to not be broken and you fucking broke it? Otherwise, exactly what did you do? What was the initiation after all? And so in a certain sense, the obstacles to our satisfaction have to be there in full force, unironically, without any meta perspective, saying no and opposing us, to be broken with total earnestness by the next generation or by the whoever it is that is eventing themselves. I mean, the experience of knowing yourself is the experience of knowing yourself through hardship and through obstacles and through oppressions, which is, by the way, I think because we've removed so many oppressions from society, we now just go around hunting for oppressions. We go around manufacturing oppressions because we don't have any extant oppressions that we're born into. And so we have to literally invent them, just as I did when I was a kid. I had to invent my own hardships because I had no initiations. Onto this idea of truth, I think that what I'm about to say is not actually like, I don't fully believe it, but I believe it very much, enough to say it anyway. That truth is basically that which has graduated into the absence of the unconscious. That's which we take for granted. I know that I'm here in the flesh because I don't think that I'm here. Like I don't think about being here in the flesh. I know that I'm going to be able to walk over to my room because I don't think about being able to walk over to my room. Whatever is truth is that which has graduated from the problematization of the consciousness into my unconscious as an absence, as something I no longer think about, as that which is second nature, as that which I take for granted. And so the truth is really that which is absent. Whereas the things that we're questioning and the things that we're not so sure about are the things that are present, the things that have become problems. And last thing I'll say is that the other couple months ago, me and my fiance, who's sitting over here buying weed for us, we went skiing, and we ended up in a pure whiteout. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have been in a absolute whiteout, but we couldn't see but 3 or 4 feet in front of us, and we're on a slope that we're unfamiliar with. So we don't know what goes down, when goes up. There's no shadows. There's no sense of up or down. The only thing you have at your disposal is a faint sense of gravity, but even that begins to get lost because your eyes start playing tricks on you, and you think that down is up at a certain point, because you think you saw a shadow, and at some point this downhill slope is going to go flat, but then you think it's still going downhill, so you're surprised by the flatness. And that surprise, that sense of fundamental, directional, ontological surprise, completely disrupted my sense of identity to the point where in those moments of the whiteout, I didn't know who I was. I was so surprised by the fundamental orientation to reality that I had no sense of who I was. Now, is that the real? Is that the truth? I'm not sure. The way I experienced it phenomenologically and emotionally was that it was a suspension of all orientation, including orientation to the self. And that once I figured out, oh no, this is downhill, that was the truth, because I was able to then forget about it again, be like, okay, no, that's the thing to make absent again. So thereby it's the truth. And I think it's an interesting thing to contemplate, the idea that the truth is that which is absent. And I haven't investigated it any further than I'm delivering it right now, but I think that there's something there.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Ebert. I'll give it to Clayton Thomas and Javier. No, I think it's a very good question on what exactly is being done on life coaching or coaching life or different things and so forth and so on. I think there's a few things that come to mind. I think it is very natural for the human being to start building something, creating something that then they destroy because they start to despair. Not like build it to where it then gets to a place where it reaches its fullness and dies naturally. But there's a tendency for the human being like to despair and to kind of destroy things that they're building at. And there are ways that we can fall into that I know that a lot of these conversations has helped me not personally fall into my own mechanisms of destroying something or losing hope in things that I'm building with people around me. Because also there's a need for these conversations to not feel like you're a crazy person. Because very often when we're talking about like the moment you say we need failure, right? Well, everyone around you is going to tell you that's stupid and doesn't make any sense, right? And you yourself, if you're engaging in that kind of level of thought, start to think that you're crazy and what the heck am I even talking about, right? Oh, well, I can talk with you people and start to understand, okay, yes, I can remember now. I'm starting to remember why exactly this is important. Because when you like, for example, are choosing to do hard things, is it ever rational to choose to do a hard thing? Well, at the time of it, probably not. Unless it's a hard thing that the social order tells you is good to do, like exercising. Okay, well, everyone else says exercising is good, and I've seen the studies, so it's something I need to do, right? Okay, that's rational. Well, other things that we've talked about at the net or in philosophical conversations that are hard to do are not so sociologically supported by everyone around you. And so if you're going to do it, having conversations with people that help you feel like you're not a crazy person because those values are not given by facticity can be very powerful and can help you continue to move forward. And also a lot of the times some of the subjects you're thinking about that you are thinking about or interested in, perhaps because you have seen things where it affects relationships, it affects love, it affects marriage, it affects yourself, your own ability to be motivated, you yourself find yourself incapable of thinking them through. you find yourself actually like entering these conversations and having ideas you never had before. Like one of the fun things is precisely the surprise that occurs from the posture of listening, or these kind of philosophical discussions that you can then remember and bring with you as you go about your life, as you go about thinking about what you're going to do. So it is, I think also philosophy, I'm always big on like self-defense, because everyone's like, everything around you is trying to manipulate you. You're constantly finding yourself being manipulated or pulled into things, and having philosophical training can help you not fall into those forms of self-deception or self-defense or things like that. So those are some thoughts that come to mind. It is a kind of life coaching, but I think it's not life coaching in the sense of like how to increase your paycheck by a certain amount. But please, Mr. Ebert.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm just, is it not akin, the idea of embracing failure, which I've espoused publicly all the time, like that's one of my main things. So it's not that I don't back that, but is it not akin, the idea of getting used to failure and embracing failure, to the very same philosophical approach to knowledge, which is to say, yes, and yes, it's that, but also this, and sort of to remain within the sort of meta-ontological point of view, which doesn't have you as a philosopher committing one way or the other, because you're always able to retain this sort of both and point of view. And is not that a negation of the courage required to actually commit and then fail? And what I'd ask is, does failure even occur in the absence of a full commitment? Unless you truly believe that you are going to succeed, can you even fail? So if you're always keeping in mind the idea of like, well, this could fail, do you actually ever experience failure? And is not that whole method just a mitigation of pain, a la Buddhistic sort of like both and middle pathing? Like, do we actually get to experience the failure if we're constantly in love with the idea of failure? Is that not just a mental rubric to mitigate pain?
Absolutely. That's why philosophy has to lead for me to an absolute choice. It has to lead to an actual doing of things. Like one of the ways you do philosophy, like, so for example, if I'm trying to figure out, like, you have to do something that you can fail at, but you also want to think of the manner of the thing that you're going to choose, that you're actually going to live, that you could fail at. And a lot of times that looks like thinking through the both sided. You say, okay, well, if I do X, that's just going to be Y and Y, so I'm not going to do any of that. But you ultimately, like the language I use based on David Hume, is you have to commit to a common life. And by a common life, that means a thing that you are always experiencing and thus facing the repercussions of the choices you made. Like you cannot escape them. You can't just be moving like a tourist through your life. Like philosophy can have a kind of tourist structure where you're never embedded in anything, and thus nothing can challenge you in any way whatsoever. I think absolutely it has to come to choice and risk. And that's why, like, for example, if you write a book in philosophy, then you have to make a claim. You have to make a statement of what you actually think needs to be done, or what's right or what's wrong, or you actually have to give your life over to a person or to an activity or to a community that you are constructing. Like for me, a lot of the absolute choice has to come to a creative act. Like you have to put stakes in the game. You have to make something. Because that could fail. And if you don't do that, you never move to the concrete. And if you never move to the concrete, then you are just using discussion about the need to embrace failure as a way to avoid failure. That's always the $1 million problem, is human beings are ironic creatures. We do everything in our power to convince ourselves that we're doing the very thing that we're talking about in a manner to help us avoid that thing. But because we can talk about it, it then functions as social currency, because it looks like that we are facing these things when actually all we're doing is talking about it. But that to me is the very tricky move of where you have to motivate people to do the things that they're talking about, or to actually make those choices as opposed to just talking about it forever. And that's then looking like sociological conditions, communities, institutions, family, where people are there to actually be embedded in something, and then to have other people motivating them into those things. And so, I mean, I agree with you that it has to come to an absolute choice. Now,
Yeah, so this is really fascinating when Ebert did this, because I'm like in the same mood that he's in, except in a different way. I'm just interested in what I'm interested about. So my question was, is it the same thing, being interested in failure versus embracing it? Because at least my thought was, we could make people interested in failure, but it doesn't mean that they should embrace it. It could mean they might embrace it, and they could also choose to not embrace it. But, and I think that's where the choice resides in my opinion, is that I'm really curious about, what if we made people interested in it? And would they embrace it? Would they not embrace it? And to me, either one is fine. But what I've noticed is the lack of interest in it. Because the way people talk about it, at least in my opinion, is there's always failure paired with success. And that's really interesting to me. Why don't we ever talk about failure as just failure, without it having any hope? So am I asking people to embrace that? I don't feel like I am, but I am interested in, why aren't we interested in it? Or why do we have a sort of disposition against it? So yeah, I mean, that's just the kind of things that popped in my mind, Alex, when you were talking about this. Because I agree with you. I don't think it should be. I think that the life coaching part is, it always comes off as normative. But I will say, I think when Daniel called philosophy a tourist section, I think my interpretation was, you might be interested in this. And if you were interested in this, this is what you might find. And maybe that's all we're really saying at the end of the day. But anyways, I mean, you definitely did the tourist thing with me, Alex, when you said, what if the law is just the law, and then we just break the law, right? That got me really interested in it. And then I also started thinking about the other way around, was, what if when I realize I break the law, I go, I don't even know what the law is, and I don't even know what I broke, but I feel like I broke something. But anyways, I'll leave it there.
I'll just respond to that very quickly, to the extent that I feel like I can, or what sparked something to me at the very end of that was remembering that I had left out a piece, which was just that, with regard to law being law, and then the life coach thing, and how do we get people to experience failure, and so forth, and then just thinking about these groups and what we tend to end up talking about, which is like how to solve something, how to, we're problematizing, we're thinking there's a problem, and we're working towards something, and we're always working on this sort of like resolution, and which in and of itself seems to be the compulsion of the philosophers to problematize, and yet I wonder if we're not forgetting that if we were to truly resolve, let's say, everything we could possibly consider, that we would be rendered inert, and that what we'd have to begin to do is problematize fictions. We invent problematizations and so on. And sometimes I just wonder, well, is not everything then in its right place? Is not the world of problems our playground? And exactly why are we trying to expedite any solving of the very kernels of enjoyment of the philosopher? I mean, now it's an interminable problem, because of course we want to solve the problem, so we need problems to solve. But sometimes I wonder, just like, if we could, I guess what I'm craving is like a more honest, speaking of truth, like a recognition that we actually enjoy the problems, and we enjoy having problems to solve. And I don't know what that recognition does exactly, but it might unlock something. And it's similar to something I crave in woke. I crave some of woke to be like, okay, you know what? We actually desire to be heroes. We desire an oppressor. And even if we were to resolve all these issues, we would still find more, because that is what gives our lives meaning. And that if somehow those things were to be acknowledged, that a surprise, there might be some special little surprise in that acknowledgement. Anyway.
No, I think it's an excellent point. I'll pass it to Clayton and then Thomas Jochen. I guess for me personally, I guess I think of philosophy like the most dangerous question. There's a difference between asking questions because you want to know why, or you want to solve, and instead figuring out a strategy to experience life as alive, or a question of the magnificent or the beautiful. We'll emphasize where you have experiences where you say, how is this happening, in a kind of awe sort of way. I think because it is not evident to me that I naturally know how to live my life in a manner that when my expectations are thwarted, I actually see that as an opportunity. Like I naturally experience when my expectations are thwarted as something that makes me angry. And what I'm instead doing is going, wait, talking about actually how failure is valuable and I need it, makes me more prepared not to solve the experience of my expectations being thwarted, but having an ability to see it as a potential creative act, as something that then can actually make me have the opportunity as a subject to rise to the occasion of that thing I did not expect it, and not blow up at my wife or blow up at my family or blow up at my coworker, right? Because I think actually this problem that we naturally have is exactly what you said. We actually like the father in the law because you tear it down. And the problem is, like, what I find is that I naturally gravitate toward the feeling of certainty that results from destruction if I don't work at it, to instead figure out how to experience something more like awe, something more like surprise, or some sort of, like, we talk about beauty all the time. Because otherwise I've just always called that the distrato thing. The temptation, like you have this urge when you see a sandcastle to kick it. Why? The moment you kick it, then you're like, you feel bad because it was beautiful, right? But there's something so exhilarating about kicking down the sandcastle. And actually, I think a lot of philosophy is actually distrato in disguise. A lot of it is actually the let's destroy things and problematize everything to make them a problem, but then like get rid of them and then find new problems. There's like a distrato that's behind a lot, something very deconstructive. And that's, as David Hume would talk about, a bad philosophy. And I guess I think about how instead do I think in a manner and have conversations that make me able to experience things in accordance with something more like awe, or an experience of how is this happening in a kind of awe way? Like, how is this happening? Wow, we're having a conversation with these people and we're saying things and it's all coming together, or you're out in names, like, how is this happening where life is unfolding? But there's a big difference. I think it's just very important to make sure that that's the direction you're going in. And I guess I personally don't find that to be the natural direction I go in, that it takes a lot of work to avoid distrato, regular, constant work to avoid that distrato tendency, and that it is not natural. So I appreciate what you were saying, because I think it's very important, because distrato would have you slip into the form of philosophy and thinking that is distrato based, as opposed to the cultivation based in terms of wonder. But let me give it to Clayton Thomas and then Phillip. Clayton.
Yeah, the thing that's just really sticking out in my mind now is, truth as the background of action. And I think what Mr. Ebert was talking about there was we're sort of like engaging in a truth mining of sorts, because like if you really think about it, like the reality in which, let's say, we dwell is a dynamic reality. So it's always shifting, right? And if it's always shifting, we're also not static, like we're dynamic creatures. So our reality is shifting, we are shifting, everything is in motion. And so for us to act, we need some sort of like basis, like we need like something static to base off to take action, right? but it is all shifting. So in a way, we have to maintain the background where we're basing off to take the action, and we have to, we have to continually shape it and know where we are as we keep going. So it's not more a know thyself; it's more like a know where I am, where I am, and how am I acting. How am I responding to the ever-shifting reality as I also shift? What is it? You have to run twice as fast to stay in the same place. From that movie. But yes, so if it seems to me, if you look at it that way, failure is more like a satisfaction of an execution of an action in retrospect. So you execute something to its failure. But that's not the goal when you're executing, right? Like you have a goal, you're trying to achieve a certain satiation. And as you're going towards that satiation, once you arrive there, then it fails, sort of, right? Like in retrospect, it looks like it sort of like lost its relevance, and so it fell to the background. And now we just work as it as something that is no longer mystical to us. So we continue because now we've conquered that, right? However, I think the way we need to look at it is not in such a way that we're trying to fix it. It's more we're trying to harmonize that fact, because we know, like by the mere fact of existing in a thing called life, that it's only for a specific period and it ends. But that doesn't stop us. Like here we are every other Friday morning having this call. At some point it will end, at some point it will fail, but that's not the goal. Like whenever that happens, it happens, right? And so leaving the space for that, ontological surprise is relevant. However, we shouldn't. It can only be a failure in retrospect. It can only be a failure in retrospect. And so all these laws that are put in place, it's more like at the time when they were put in place, there were real obstacles because, there were guardrails. There was something on the other side that they were protecting us against. And given our dynamic nature, as the environment shifts, we find ourselves not shaped to it in the way we thought could work or that is functional anymore. And then we come to what you're saying, Daniel, we have to reinvent. And so the reinvention has to always be happening. And so you need to find that place where you're reinventing so that you're in contact with the ever-shifting reality. And it's not, the gap between you and it is not ever so broad that you lose touch of it, because then there's real consequences for that, and you may actually just be wiped out of the game. And so the reinvention is important to extend that streak of not reaching the end while continuing. And once you get to the end, it's probably just opening more doors for another gutter, to use Daniel's language, another gutter to follow, as opposed to kind of reminiscing that there's nothing else. So it's more like getting you to a point so that you can continue and keep continuing. And in retrospect, it looks like a failure, but in action, it does not, you'd say, the goal is not that. And even in the experience of reaching the end can feel like it's a sad, grieving moment because it ended and it feels like failure, but that is only in retrospect. That's only after it has happened. It's not before it happens. Like you can't aim for failure. It's I don't know how you do that.
No, I'll pass it to Mr. Jock and Phillip and then Michelle. I think like part of the problem, like you say, is that action requires a kind of static background, but that means you're in risk of closed-mindedness, fascism, givens, and different things. So you need to be changing it. How do you alter your background, make it fluid, but not so fluid it's chaos and you can't act, or you're confused in your action. And there's something about philosophy that has this ability to try to kind of make a moving staticity, like a moving given, so that you can operate according to it. I think also on this kind of idea that failure is retrospect, because at the time it is not a failure. I think that's very important, because also too, if you overthink the fact that everything is finite or it's ultimately all going to fail or so on and so forth, then you are always setting yourself up to never do anything or to give up, because you're going to define all the moments of it as failure as well. That's where you're making the mistake of defining the whole relative to the end, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think also it's just interesting because I just like speaking with you people and seeing you people. And if we don't why would we get together if we didn't have a topic, right? There's this dilemma of what would be the reason to talk? Or if let's say we didn't talk philosophy, let's say we talked about football, it'd be pretty boring. People would start to drift away, right? Like there's an issue on what is the reason you get together with people all around the world who you want to see, and not just be something where you see them once every few months, but a regular orbiting principle to make possible something like community in a world where it seems really hard to get that. What in the world would be the topic? What else would it be other than philosophy? Bowling? Maybe it could be bowling. My grandmother was a heck of a bowler, but y'all don't live here to go bowling. What was that, Michelle?
We could just all get here and dance. Like it could be a
dance party. We could do a dancing party but it's actually very interesting because there's a kind of like if y'all all lived in Lynchburg, we could go bowling every Friday. That would be great. But some of you may hate bowling, right? So there's this weird principle of how do you what is the subject that would provide a reason to orbit, to regularly see one another that's not so stale that it gets boring and you stop doing it, but also not so new and different every single time that it's chaotic and it alienates people, right? There's this weird tension there. Now, religions have done it with things like theology. That's pretty close to philosophy or the Bible or a book. What's so interesting, if most human civilizations have organized according to religion, which I think is generally true, religion has been a main glue of society, right or wrong. Well, what's so interesting is that religion is pretty reading books, philosophy, thinking. Now, it's not just that. You also have to go serve the community and act. And all of us, because we live in different places, have to do that independent of the Zoom call. Whereas if you were in a church, you'd see everyone doing the action thing in addition. Here, there's a visual dilemma where no one gets to go see the individual actions that people do after the service, per se, of which is reflected in the conversations that they had. Therefore, the impression of the Zoom conversation is head on a stick, because it almost has to, whereas in a lived gathering of this kind of conversation, where you would be seeing Sue down the street because she's coming together at the same communal bowling alley, church, or whatever, that would be worked against. But instead, there's a separation between, if you're talking church, service and action. Right. And but it's interesting because, again, a reason to come together and to speak, that's what something philosophy can provide. So then the question is, what is philosophy doing? And I definitely think on this idea of solving I'm the problem. That's why I'm surrounded by problems. I make problems, but by definition, I don't mean to make problems, because I wouldn't do it if I meant it. You can't intend to make problems for yourself, right? If you go exercising and it's hard, then that's not making a problem for yourself. That's what we were saying at the beginning. You plan it, it's in your symbolic and imaginary registers. It's part of what you want to do. The problem is I find that I, Daniel Garner, create problems for myself and do not intend to. Well, frick. And I don't even know how I do it. So then we have to talk about everything because I don't know what's causing it. That's the problem. If you're causing it, my internet might be glitchy at this moment, but it's if I cause problems for myself, by definition, I do not intend it, and I don't even know how it is doing, then we just got to jump into philosophy and talk about everything and figure out what the heck is going on, right? That's part of the issue, is you find yourself entering a space like this because you're you want to figure out what's going on, because if you knew what was going on, it wouldn't be happening. Right? Or you find yourself incapable of just being inspired by snapping your finger, or experiencing beauty by snapping your finger. There's some sort of conditions you have to meet to have those experiences. What are they? Well, if you knew, you would go do them. And so you find yourself entering into these spaces some for the communal logistical dimension, the topic of conversation, but also because you find yourself stumbling into these things, not knowing why you're stumbling into problems or why your ideas don't work out. And then these kind of conversations can help with that. I said a lot. Let me pass it to Mr. Jockin, Phillip, Michelle, and then Javier. Mr. Jockin.
Good to see you all. Alex, I really appreciate your provocation. I think a couple of weeks ago, Luber was asking, "Where's the disagreement? Give me some tension. I need some heat in here." And you definitely got some, clearly, by asking this question. I think you're making a very great point over this question, this issue to bring up. Because I think one of the biggest risks of anyone in the philosophy space is this not just a gigantic game of code. Especially us. And I come from a Aristotelian background. So I'm in this class, I'm like, here's the point. I think the projects and the program of modernity failed. This shit ain't working. So there's a serious point of, you go back to Aristotle, to Aquinas, you go back to Al-Ghazali, you go back to all these historical figures. There's a serious critique if you just take that and go, oh, well, obviously I could just take that and just copy paste that today. So highlight, copy paste. We're going to act exactly. We're going to follow the same protocols, operate exactly the same way as Aquinas did, or as Aristotle did, as Al-Ghazali did. That's at best LARPing, at best, because all it's going to take is some crisis, some conflict, where that old model will no longer apply to a modern model. One of those classic points is that individual rights does not exist in those time periods, and the idea of kind of normative cultural modes that had a right to dictate us how do we shape our souls. That is completely foreign to us now. It is. Thus, the example of the destructionary mode of philosophy, as Daniel's commented, people have as well. That's a huge point. And by the way, if you go into spaces, I've been in spaces where it's been predominantly Aristotelian or any other kind of dominant and ancient mode of philosophy, you get a feeling like that could definitely happen. Basically a huge coping mechanism of they're just reproducing the mimetic pattern of Aristotle or Aquinas. And word for word, same examples, same language, everything. It doesn't work because it's not going to, once it comes into conflict with the conditions and limitations of today, it breaks. So I think that's actually a very fair point. So thus, that's my one segue to go into all this philosophy stuff has to convert to ethics. It has to. There is no, you have to answer the question. You got to create some kind of hypothetical necessity that you need to structure your life in a certain way. And as a result, you're going to have to operate with certain costly signals of action that are going to require something of you. And you might have to put it at risk to lose it all. That your hypothetical necessity was a failure. And I think actually a good pretense is actually to use, I'll give you parts of this, Alex. I think it makes, I'm trying very strongly defending the argument here. I just want to acknowledge you're pointing a very serious concern. I think in a lot of spaces they have that problem. There's the pure cope of, quite frankly, privileged people who really, quite frankly, are just trying to manage the anxieties of modernity, when really materially they really have no need. There really are no problems for them, quite frankly. I think you're making a very fair critique, but I want to now pause to the positive side of what you're saying, or just reply to you on that. One part is, personally, because I come from a Aristotelian, Aquinas, Islamic tradition, and I come from a visual art background, I get a lot of value coming to this as basically a mental agitator, where I get all these models presented to me from Hegel, Lacan, et cetera, right? Those are fields I've not read. I haven't read those guys. It's going to be probably 10 years before I get to them, quite frankly. So as a result, this is basically a supercharged agitator to just throw at me a bunch of models that I then take and go, oh, that's really interesting. I basically get provocated. It's a kind of surprise by provocation, right? So that's one of your value utility. Now you lose that if you go into a space that's all Lacan, all Aristotle, all some X model, you fails, because then you're getting there is no agitation. So I think that's like a practical value, like what I get from being in this space. But then there's some other ones, and at least what Daniel was talking about is habituation. And one of the most important things that Aristotle talks about friendship is habituation must be with close proximity. You cannot be friends with people that are afar. Now he uses a spatial dynamic, and obviously we're not in the same space together. But interesting enough, through the virtual space, right, of this Zoom apparatus, and probably the habituation of time, one can make the argument space and time if you accept their equivalents, then by just repetition of time of these virtual vectors, we basically get the same, we get a proximity by that. And I know that because, for example, I have a certain care for you all as friends, especially the Garners. And I know that by not just my statements, like but by my actions. For example, the Garners recently like OG Rose, they published their books. I saw that, and I actually felt out of a friendship mode with them. I'm going kind of meta to commentate about this, but out of friendship to them, because I knew how much work it takes to write a book. And I have such respect for them. I basically organized a little reading group privately. I secretly contacted a bunch of people I knew were friends with the Garners, and we organized a little surprise reading group together. We read the whole Belonging Again text, and then we agreed in a month to come together and do a discussion review about it. We then also followed that up with reviews on Amazon. So, like, why? Why did we do that? Was there any requirement to do that? Absolutely not. It was because I believe in virtue ethics and friendship so seriously that it almost would pain me out of hypocrisy that someone I respect and care for so much, that I would not support their ventures in the ways I could through those modes of costly sacrifices. What did I cost? My time, my energy, etc. So thus not only did I meet the Garners through online spaces, through these habituations of spaces they're providing, right, for this platform, I also just through intellectual discussions with them. We actually, Aristotle would say this is the highest level of friendship. As Daniel pointed out, it's like, well, so we're going to talk about it every week. Philosophy, friendship via philosophy is probably one of the strongest ones, I would argue, besides your family and other kind of argue structures like that. So I'm just pointing out this as a demonstration, like, right, the pretense of the activity here, if it does not convert to some action or some kind of mode of care, you got to give a fuck about people, like the people you're interacting with. And I think that is a very important apparatus, at least for me personally, about why this is worth doing. And it has to be put to a measure of how you're acting out in your life. We do all this philosophy stuff, especially if you're going down, if you come down to a virtue ethics model with the necessity of the civic virtues and the necessity of friendship, right? And a modality and a kind of doctrine of love, right? In a sense of, remember, philosophy is love of wisdom, right? Which is, or if you want to go love of the beautiful, so, Phillip Shinn, for example, you kind of need to make a commitment to yourself that you're going to have to demonstrate that in some way. You can't just talk about it. You can't just live in a world of simulations of just talking, because who gives a shit? Congratulations. There's a lot of people who talk a big game about a lot of things, but don't execute, don't do anything. And then what of it? It's useless. So I just wanted to say, like, absolutely, if this doesn't convert to some mode, I would argue, of friendship and acting on that and communing with each other, then you're doing this wrong. I think good philosophy should do that. That's like the minimum standard, I would say, within this context, let alone how it should shape your life personally, that you should hold yourself in contempt, that you have models that were given to you, they all failed. You took a responsibility to say the models failed. I got to go find something else to go make this work. Because we talked about a couple weeks ago, and here's a good example. I've been chewing on this, and I apologize for my long discussion, my long point. This idea that if we do not have a narrative of how we structure our lives, and especially models of forgiveness, response to failure, radical failure, like you failed such immensely, you will self-destruct. You will self-exit, to use that language. And I think that's a super strong point, that the need of some kind of structure model, we all need it. We're all going to get it. Most people opt for what it's given to them and just operate with that and gets good enough. And then mediated by medication and alcohol or whatever, take your pick. That acceptance of the model and confronting it, and then adjusting your life in response to it. Like, I think that's like the structure of the whole setup. And one last one on failure. You know, actually, is even worse, by the way, than even getting the failure, like running away from it, being afraid of it, and all that. Well, I've experienced personally this in my life in certain points. When you achieve the thing you were desiring and it fails, you realize how lacking it is. Concrete example, I'll close with this. I competed as an amateur boxer. I trained my freaking face off for 2 years to get to compete. I won my fights, and I remember the deafening silence, bittersweet silence. I tasted it when my hand was raised with the knockout. This was all I suffered, all I worked for, all these things was for this moment. and I realized how lacking it was. So that's a failure of even the most devastating kind. It's basically what rich people get, right? Basically who struggle and they get success and then they spiral. It's another example of that. Just a very much more micro version of it. Yeah, so to kind of close and actually kind of paint the picture, trying to spiral this all together to tie it all up. It's actually a doctrine of love. You become a disciple of love when you realize that your love that you were desiring was a failure. It failed. It was actually not the true love. It was a complete failure. Because even in the achievement of it, you still lost. You lacked. And ultimately, via philosophy and virtue ethics, my argument, you're going to find out that most likely, nice. See Javier. Friendship, you're going to realize, is probably the most powerful object of one's love you can give. And now I'm making a claim. You can challenge me on it, but I'll make the claim. I think it is the most powerful thing. Because I think in a life ordered by love and your friendship of virtue, nothing that is never unlacking. Like the acts of charity that I gave to the Garners for that book review and doing all that stuff. Again, I'm only pointing this out just to give an example. So I'm not just talking pure abstractions. That was a price to be paid that I did not feel that sense of, I did not feel that lacking feeling versus that struggle to win a victory in boxing. No, in that friendship, in that act of charity and friendship, there was nothing but a downing, basically kind of a downing overflow of giving. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. And I'll close with that. Thank you for humoring me. I just wanted to say, Alex, your point was very fair. And I think anyone in the philosophy has to seriously consider your point. I think it's very fair.
Oh, outstanding. And it certainly an act of love and friendship, Mr. Jockin. It means the world. Thank you, sir. A few things come to mind. I like what you were talking about, the mental agitator. I think basically philosophy has to create conditions of where you event yourself. We were saying that at the beginning versus know yourself. And that requires some sort of intentional space of agitation. I find that I personally, without those spaces of agitation, tend to fall into models, single ways of thinking that then without realizing it, you take those with you into the world and kind of basically treat people as if they should all fit into that one way of thinking. And that the agitation can actually keep you open to the other. And you need like regular practices of agitation. Yeah, and I just also think about like, for example, like people come up to you in your life and say, trust is something earned. Like I encountered that. I used to think that. And then one day I said, you know, I see all these people who are saying trust must be earned, and they end up in these kind of power dynamics that are really pathological. I wonder why that is. So I sat down and wrote it, you know, Michelle and I did a paper called On Trust and talked about what is trust? When does it work or not? So you wrote this paper because one, you can't keep up with your own thoughts all in your head. You need to see them on the paper as you're going through and you say, oh, trust that has to be earned is a contradiction. Trust is the relationship itself. It's not something you earn. You either choose it or not. Okay, well then when you move into relationships, you don't make that mistake anymore, right? Another one is like, okay, you see people whose lives seem destroyed by fear, or you yourself have your life destroyed by fear. But then the world is full of bad things. So what's the difference between fear and wisdom? When is it good? Like, when is it wise to be aware of bad things? And when is it paranoia? I didn't know. So you sit down and you're writing it. You go read thinkers on it so that your life is not a slave to that inability to know the difference between fear and wisdom or meta mentality, et cetera, et cetera. We could go on and on and on. And the issue is, if you don't write that paper, you actually do that to other people. And you're hurting them, like Eber was asking a great question in the chat. Like, if you don't know the difference between fear and wisdom, you may tell the people that you love and care about, you may tell them to live their life according to fear, thinking that you're helping them live their life according to wisdom. And then one day, they will be in a place they don't want to be, and they won't even know how they got there. And you yourself will not even be able to identify that you're one of the reasons they ended up there, because you haven't thought about the topic, and thus you are contributing to this pain. And you're not even able to stop yourself. So there was some more thoughts, but let me pass it to Philip and then Michelle and then Javier. Philip, please.
Bring back that lacking feeling. Oh, that lack. Can you hear me all right? Yo, this is a moment I'm really glad technology is working and I'm able to be here with y'all. If I were with Ebert when he got that whiteout, I would say ski with your feet, not with your eyes. I don't mean to be like a life coach or anything, maybe like a ski coach. And like maybe like sometimes I feel like I'm walking on water, although be it very cold water out here. And maybe that's what good old Jesus was saying to Peter, you know, don't do this activity with your eyes. I think there are some things that are just like, there's no point in giving any advice. But there are other things that I think are obvious, that actually bring us together. Is like, we come together, at least for me, I think, because when I want to like dance with my mouth in a certain way that when I do it around other people, they're just like, what? Like when you say like, we should just come together and dance, I feel like what we're doing is we're moving our lips, our teeth, our tongue a certain way that in, you know, the great big bad world, people are just like, we don't have time to talk about that. Or like, I don't want to go into that, dude. Or like that joke Chappelle has about his like cousin that never worries about like killing himself because all he does is work and then get like a big gulp or something. But yeah, it is a problem of prosperity, without a doubt. And I don't think we're trying to like re-solve anything. We're trying to re-problematize things. One of the things I like about like the Greek word stasis also means civil war, and that may be a continual state. So like, it's not even something. I like this idea of eventing ourselves as well as inventing ourselves through the events. And kind of giving up the hope of a big rest and, you know, if you want, signal to other people, hey, we could have different problems like in society or whatever. But I also like, I think it was Javier I'm doing a play with Van Gogh right now, and there's that movie At Eternity's Gates where he's like, I stopped worrying about teaching people and I started worrying about my relationship with eternity. And so, yeah, I think that's like another possibility. And also, I think like, if there's anything to learn from Lacan, it's like there are consequences if you don't talk. Like if you don't speak, like that energy doesn't just like become neutral. Like that is gonna kind of come back. So I was joking, and I know Clayton, we had a laugh a couple times ago. It's like, in a way, like this makes me more tolerable. And you know, it's tough to tell because everything is so contingent, whether or not one day this will not be a necessity. But like until then, I'm very grateful to be here with people that are thinking these things. So cheers.
You're beautiful, Phillip. And that may have been the greatest no screen, visual screen moment ever. Like, bam, I'm on the ski range. That's amazing. Well, I think this idea of that there's an energy that's not just going to go away, you have to do something with. And speaking has a way of dealing with the energy. Definitely, in having people that you can speak philosophy with, I'm probably way more tolerable with people, or I'm able to actually put my head down and go to work and do things there and it not be so despairing. Because you feel like, yes, you're you're using that energy, because any energy you have that you don't use becomes a burden. It becomes something that kind of destroys you, I think. It becomes like a fire that burns you. So I think there's definitely truth to that. I think also what's interesting is philosophy almost has a disadvantage as the thing you share. Like if you share bowling, and I'll give it to Michelle and Javier. Why do you bowl? Well, because we're bowling. That's a stupid question. You would never ask, why are you bowling? And what's the point of this if you're bowling, right? But if like a thing that gathers people together is philosophy, philosophy's whole thing is asking like asking questions. That's part of it. So it's automatically set up to be like, well, what's the whole, why even do it? And so it can kind of be undermined by the very structure of its activity in ways that are perhaps unique to say bowling or unique to say gardening or different things, which arguably is one of the reasons why it can actually avoid becoming static or like frozen, because you can always kind of crack at it, like agitate it again, like Mr. Ebert, like you agitate it again because it's just problem solving and then give it a new life. So there's an advantage to that. But then that would require the people of whom are engaging in that agitation to be able to handle it without, say, despairing. or going, yeah, you're right, what's the point, forget it, and then we're all done, right? You know, you could do that, but that's getting to this idea of what would it look like to have a society or people or communities that could engage, and in fact engage in that, or to deal with that, because that would have impacts on how you think about your kids or different things. But anyway, let me pass it to Michelle and then Javier. Michelle.
Yes, I just realized that. Okay, yeah, it's so great to see you all. This is a wonderful conversation. And I really like the distinction that Javier brought up about like trying to be more truthful versus truth itself, right? Because I can have something that I'm trying to be truthful about, and I might be very apprehensive to be truthful about it because I'm scared that it won't be understood, right? Because the other person says, well, no, that's not true, right? Like, but for whatever reason, it has felt truthful to me, right? Like it's these narratives we have in our head. Well, I feel like you're doing this because you don't want to spend time with me, whatever it is. Okay. These are like our narratives. I think what can be helpful about being truthful is that it might help us to be able to become more full of truth, right? Like when we are able to be truthful, right? Take that energy of the words of what we're feeling, what we're still processing. And that can either be like working through it yourself through writing. I think that can be very helpful to try and work through it yourself, right? Just before you just kind of explode on the other person or just sort of emotively talk to the other person. But you still will need to kind of be vulnerable enough and courageous enough to actually open your mouth and talk to them and say, here's what I'm experiencing. I know this is truthful for me right now, but it's probably not the truth, because the truth is going to be met in the conception of those two people, right? In the actual coming together of those two people. That's where the truth is, right? And so it's not just one person or the other. So something that I want to share that's like just from a personal perspective that isn't necessarily the truth for other people, but it's truthful for me, that sometimes I have felt like the philosophical spheres feel most sort of like hamster on a wheel when I'm not doing something I know I need to do. When I know that philosophy has brought me to the place, or theology, whichever area of your sort of like compelling is going, when I've been brought to the place through that, where I'm like, oh shoot, that means I need to do something. I need to face this fear. I need to say this thing. I need to change doing this. I actually need to be courageous here. And I'm just not doing it because I'm too damn scared, honestly. Then that's when it feels very masturbatory. The philosophy spaces to me, and it's nobody else's fault. It's mine. It's me not kind of doing the action like Clayton's talking about, the doing, the action of what I'm actually learning. Like, am I doing something with this? Am I actually allowing it to transform me and change me? And for the sake of being more refined, like becoming like refining by that fire, to me, that's why, or that's where I get that feeling sometimes. It's like, what are we doing? Why am I doing this? Blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, because I'm not even doing the thing I know I need to do. Like, I'm not even facing that fear. I'm not even being brave enough to take the philosophy and the theology I'm learning and do something about it. Like, actually live it. I'm not. And that's when it feels this kind of like, blah, 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 like, what are we doing? I don't understand, blah, blah, blah. But I think showing up to the what's the point reminds me about this profound point of it all, right? This kind of like pointless point sort of thing, right? This thing that we're in the movement of, right? This dancing with our mouths kind of concept. I think that to me, like why I think it's important to show up even on the times when I'm feeling like, well, what's the point? It's because that's the point. Like it everybody here shows me a type of bravery and doing something that can seem so stupid and why, and I don't understand it. What's it doing? Well, it's a type of reminder for me to face my fears and actually do something, not just read about it, not just talk about it, not just write about it, but actually do it. And that is so transformative when you do the thing. And we will always we will always have that demand on us to continue to face things again and again and again in life, because that's the nature of life, right? The unexpected. Now, I think there are things that one can do over other things that would make them more open to the unexpected. And I think those are helpful things as well. I really do. But I think there's this, so I just wanted to say those things, like the fact that the truthful thing for me is that things can feel sort of like, why, when really I should be asking myself, why haven't I done the thing I know I need to do? Now, how do I know I need to do that thing? Or how do I know that's a fear I need to face? That's probably also related to philosophy and theology to some degrees, because, you know, you actually get self-reflective. You actually sit with yourself in that silence and that uncomfortable feeling and that uncomfortable, oh yeah, I'm kind of ignoring that thing like at the back of my mind or the back of my heart that I know is there. And so anyways, but I will say, and actually not that we'll do this perfectly, this is where the failure comes in, but when we try and when we actually do the things, I do see that like philosophy is reinvigorated with life itself, where it has that like, it's like the why is what it is in pushing me to continue to face fear. Because and it might not be relevant for anybody else. It might not strike a chord for anybody else. But I know that I have like deep fears about certain things. And I'm just like, I don't know if I'm just stubborn. I'm like, I'm not going to continue to live this in life. Like, this is my life. So I don't want to continue to live with those fears controlling me, without me even like realizing it or without my even acknowledging it. I want to become fearless, and that's not now necessarily. And I probably will have to do things still afraid, but I want desperately to become more fearless. So that's why to me it's really important. Like, everybody here shows me that, like, the bravery to do something stupid and pointless, that being the point. So anyways, thank you.
No, I think that's magnificent, Michelle. I think absolutely we can talk all day about, doing things for their own sakes, or not doing it because we make money, or not because we want to gain status or whatever, but it's entirely something else to actually do something that could be pointless, or in a way is pointless, or the point is something that you can't put into words. And there's a certain of courage and bravery that comes of that. And I think one of the ways like philosophy can avoid that is by being too rigid in the language game, or being like, well, we're all just going to be Humean scholars and talk Hume. And then you don't have to face that agitation or that risk of it being pointless because you know it's going to be about Hume, right? But when you because like every net conversation could be a disaster, right? There's always the possibility of someone getting upset or someone getting hurt, or there's always kind of a risk, right? Or who knows what's going to go on, right? Because there's no preset plan, right? And everyone has to be willing to come into this space not knowing what the heck's going to say, or maybe it'll be boring. Maybe no one will say anything interesting. And so there's a kind of facing that. And then, can we actually tell anyone if someone asks you, so what were you doing this afternoon? I was talking with people. That's kind of naked. You can't say, well, I was at work. I was making money for the family. Oh, okay. So there is something, I think, important about doing something pointless. The last thing I'll say, another thing I would say is I find doing philosophy helps me from taking things personally. Like when someone hurts me or I misunderstand something, you're able to say, well, I can see why they did that, because you've thought through, or you say, well, this is why, and so on and so forth. And actually, there's value to both. I disagree with them, but there's value to both. And that's where you're using the bothness to not get angry in a kind of lashing out way, or to not take things personally. And in the same way that philosophy is the developing the courage to do something pointless can be a part of it. There's also something about it that I find helps you not take things personally. And that makes you more able to interact with difference and people who have different points of view than you, and to kind of go out various comfort zones and to try different things. Because if you encounter something you don't understand, you have kind of the mental tools by which to not be overwhelmed or to take personally or to be deeply hurt by that thing you don't understand. So I think that's and I'm prone, naturally to take things personally, or to get offended, or to be angry, or to have a little voice in my head talking about how stupid those people are, right? It takes a lot of regular practices and work not to do that, right? And I think also too, like Clayton has said this, one of the main things that I think is something that humans tend to do is we tend to hear what people say, not what they mean. And so many, like Chekhov said, that most people, to understand a marriage, you have to understand that people are constantly misinterpreting one another and misunderstanding one another. And that very misunderstanding leads to hurt and taking things personally. There's something about doing the pointless point or the philosophy that actually gets you better at kind of understanding what a person means, even if it's not what they said, for you to kind of keep in mind the bigger context so that you can work with that. That then is really needed to not take things personally or to get upset or to work with diversity and so on and so forth. But let me pass it to Javier and then Mr. Ebert. Javier.
Yeah, I mean, a lot was said. I've been I've been like practicing like free floating attention, which means also not paying attention. And then also just kind of like, kind of like a dog, just kind of like being really interested about what I smell when I smell it. Like why does that suddenly attract me? Something you said, Daniel, like very early on. You said something like, I write because if you don't write, you do that to other people, something like that. And the line that came up to my mind immediately was, I write because I've stopped living in some way. In some way, I've stopped living, and that's why I write. The other thing is, I'm really happy Jochen finally brought up love, because what I wrote recently about orgasm, between orgasm and love, and this will be the really narcissistic part about me, is the very last line that I wrote, which was, I said, suddenly love makes us think about all the possibilities beyond winning and losing, and how we might like to go about them. Love comes in where sex fails, but when love fails, we have a hard time not talking about sex. Which, the way I interpret that means is, there's something about life that always tempts us to think about winning and losing, which is another way of saying we're always really tempted about succeeding and failing. But this is the part that I'd like to tie in Ebert's point about problematizing, is that I think the ambivalent part about love is that it makes you question what you desire. It says, I have a feeling of what I desire, but now that I'm in a relationship with somebody else, it makes me go, what might I desire more than what I had previously thought about? And that's the part that I feel like we can't escape ever talking about when we talk about love. Like the fact that love problematizes, it's the first time when love comes in that we question our desire. Do I actually want this? Because if I want this, it might mean I lose that. Or it might mean that I get cut off from that. It's the whole castration thing. But at the same time, it really is the first time that we start second guessing our desires and what we want. And I think when we come to philosophize, it's because we're deeply in love with something. And that might also become a problem itself. Like, for example, we might be saying like, well, I've seen a problem because I love something and I don't know what I want more. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. What do I want more? And then we start talking to people, and then other people say, well, you might like this too. And I say, well, that's interesting. I never thought about that. That interests me too. So I've been really fascinated about giving up the way I think about philosophy and more about what interests me and what might interest me more. And it has a lot to do with my reading of Adam Phillips and why I'm so fascinated with him. But I think for me, at least, it finally uncovered why I really love philosophy. Because there's also a part of philosophy that I hate. I really hate about it. But also at the same time, it's always making me question, well, what do you want more? And I'm like, I don't fucking know. But it's very clear that I want something. And so the other thing that came up was, maybe truth should always be a problem. But the real problem, and this might be connected to what Ebert was saying, is that we have a problem leaving it as a problem. That's the problem. That's the part that we might have a problem doing. I think Miriam Milner talks about, I think her in a book, it's called Not Painting, or How to Not Paint, really fascinated me with this line. I haven't finished the book, or I just got curious about it. But there was a line that she said, you know, when you're painting, you're really tempted to connect all the dots and try to make something out of it. But you might be interested in practicing not connecting the dots and not trying to make something out of it, which I think finally I connected that to my philosophizing, where I'm just like, you know what? I'm just going to trace whatever I find is interesting to me. And then whatever comes out, that's fine. I'm not really interested in whether it's true or not. I'm just interested in the fact that I'm deeply attracted to it. And I'm trying to discover why. And then maybe I'm talking to you guys might say something more about it. And I might be like, that's interesting. But all right, I'll leave it there.
I think that was very beautifully put. I love that notion of this feeling of being attracted to something and being like, why? And you're like, oh, let me come here. Let me talk to the end of this thing. What is this sort of thing? I think there's something very beautiful about that. I think there's a lot of truth. I think definitely I can speak personally, this kind of finding something attracting you or some sort of problem or sort of idea. And you're like, oh, let me talk to Bernard. Oh, let me talk to these people gathering at Eunoia and different things. And I also say, the other thing I would say, I guess as well, like, I mostly grew up, say, writing science fiction, walking in the woods. I ran a photography business, creative writing and different things. But it was one way in Eunoia for 8 years, and where you're running into diversity and different people, and you hear all the stories of these kids who grew up with parents that devastated them. And increasingly you go, I doubt that those parents meant to devastate them. Or you hear about people in these relationships like, oh, I said to this, trying to like connect with you, and that actually you took as being very insensitive. Or you took that as hurt. It's like, what in the world? And you start realizing that everyone is constantly, including yourself, like hurting one another and not meaning to. And that's really when then having these long conversations, like at the community center with like Evan or Bernard, like talking through all these issues, going like, wow, because I guess for me, I was like, why couldn't I just end up like those parents? Like who hurt their kids into new mental? Why couldn't I just end up like all these people? Like, but I wouldn't mean to. And then it's like, surely no one intends to, unless they're just, it's kind of easy to say, well, it's just because they're evil or they're stupid or something. It's like, what if you assume they're not? Oh my gosh, then there's problems that we don't even know we could fall into that we have to think through. And that too was part of it. And then also if you have kids, you're raising kids or people are asking you, what do you think? Like, you're having to make an absolute choice. You're having to make choices regarding those things. So those but that what you were saying about the love, I think it suggests the kind of relational structure that I think I can speak to. So I appreciate that. But let me pass to Mr. Alex Ebert. Mr. Ebert.
It's been a really good talk, and I appreciate it. I love the way everyone caught my grenade stick. So to speak. I really love just the phrase that Javier just mentioned, that love problematizes desire. I think that can shoot off in a million different directions, and it's a wonderfully different way of illustrating the love as sacrifice notion. I wonder how love relates, though, to free-floating attention. And if it's not the case that love problematizes free-floating attention. But I'll just sort of leave you with that. I think I love what Thomas was saying with regard to highlighting the other reason we get together, which is simply to be together. And I remain curious as to the levels of organization which feel free to admit as much versus those that don't. Usually in a congregation, as far as I'm aware, as far as I've learned, the congregation itself is pretty free to admit that among its top reasons for congregating is the congregating itself, not the ideas transmitted, but the community that arrives or is extracted from the congregation. The priestly class less inclined to admit as much, because they're there to sort of ordain an abstracted reason for the congregation that would differentiate this sort of congregating from another sort of congregating, and make this particular variety of congregating more important, or at the very least specific unto itself, such that you wouldn't get this sort of congregation from simply congregating elsewhere. In the case of philosophy, you know, in the absence of a strident sort of like monotheistic ideology, not monotheistic, but I want to say like a mono ideology, like a singular ideology with regard to the philosophy that we're philosophizing around. You know, we're constantly popcorning, and we're all over the place. So there's no way to say that, well, no, this particular variety of congregating is fundamentally, or in some abstract sense, different. The only difference would be that it's this particular facilitation, you know, the gardeners and so on, and the cast of characters that tend to show up. But I guess, you know, for instance, when I've presented this very notion in a lot of ways to IDW, the online, you know, intellectual deep web, Alexander Bard's group. And I've suggested that the only reason they exist is or the primary reason they exist. I designate that group as a struggle cluster, and that their struggle is primarily in the beginning, in its conception, against woke ideology. And so that they had this sense of like being a struggle cluster and against something, but it was about this communing and congregational sort of camaraderie and a sense of otherness, which helped to bind the interiority of the group and so on. Very classic. But anytime I suggested that might be the impetus and the cohesive for the group, rejected out of knee-jerk ideological rejection that seemed to suggest that if they were to allow the idea that the congregation had a instrumental cohesive beyond these abstract notions, beyond a sort of project, beyond a sort of world building, Bildung sort of project, that it would somehow disrepute and disband the group if it were to admit that the reason it was in existence in the first place was to provide a sort of shelter from the woke storm, or to create a sort of cohesive that was first and foremost about the congregation as opposed to about the ideas. And it wasn't simply that it got dismissed as, you know, 2 or 3 on the ladder. It was just roundly dismissed as absolutely not. None of the reason why we're here together. It's all about these radical ideas and moving forward. There's nothing about being together in this sort of like, in this sense. And there's certainly no big other. And we're certainly not going to attribute our congregation or the cohesive factor of this congregation to our enemy for binding us so, right? We're not going to thank woke for binding us. And I found that to be an incredible blind spot, but I also found it to be typical of what seems to be required in the cohering of a society. There seem to be required certain blind spots. And while Thomas was readily able to admit freely that, like, and maybe in philosophical context, it's easier to admit something like, I come here for the congregation. But there seem to be cases where either larger beyond Dunbar's cap or or in more sort of romantically religious contexts where we feel like we have a world-changing project, where you can't allow there to be a contingency. It must be pure necessity. I don't know, but anyway, yeah, just thinking through that. So anyway, it has been great to be here, and cheerio.
I love everything you just said. The main point of the net is the friendship. That's why we're here. Everything else follows from that and is secondary. And all the other things, they don't ultimately matter if there is no friendship. This side, everything comes down to the capacity of human beings to be friends for the sake of being friends. I do think that there's something about philosophy that allows people to speak with one another in a way to maintain the friendship and to have subjects of discussion that allows them to be motivated toward life in different ways. And so there's a character, because you also, philosophy, like I'm saying, I think there's something about philosophy that helps you when your friend hurts you, which critically note, your friend is in the position to hurt you by being a friend. That's the problem. The more intimately you are connected with people, that is precisely the danger place. So how do you keep that danger from turning into, I now hate this person, or I've now been hurt because I said something they misunderstand? That's to me where the philosophy, and it's almost like sometimes you almost are looking for a different word, and people talk about this all the time, but to be able to mediate instincts, to keep the friendship alive, to create a kind of beauty in the friendship, that's where philosophy has a lot of service to it. And I would just, I think that that is absolutely central. So I appreciate what you were saying, but let me pass it to Javier before we close it out. I will have to run here, but Javier, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. This has been a really good talk. There's something Ebert said about the way Thomas was admitting about, he said you could probably justify it through a philosophical language about why we're here. Which I want to say my inclination is that I absolutely agree, because when I talk to my partner, the hardest thing to do is to not use that philosophical justification or that language, because what my partner hears, what she tends to hear is this: you're telling me, however you're telling me, how to live my life, and I don't want to be told about how to live my life. So I've had to change my language a lot. Now, I will say the language, the philosophical language, works a lot here. And I think we're okay with that, because I think a lot of us generally understand and know that we can feel we feel that we have the room to disagree, and we can also reject any claims that we might feel as prescriptive or normative. But what I do find striking is how I have to change my language, and how sometimes even the space that we use for philosophical, jargon might also demand that we have to change our language, or not. I don't really know, but it has been fascinating for me to take part in how do I change my language and make it more interesting. Because saying things like, well, it's a necessity, it's a contingency, to my partner would be like, she'd be like, yawn, 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 yawn. I'm going to continue watching whatever now, which is fine, because that's the language that really interests us. But when I talk to my partner, it's more like, well, why do you think that way? Or what comes to mind when you say this? And then I say something else like, well, have you ever thought about it this way? Or could we think about it this way? And would it be interesting to look at it this way? But I think, funny enough, it still always comes down to, I just really want you to be a part of the conversation, right? It's a really fascinating thing in terms of, that we're talking, but also it's because we just want to be talking. We just want to be talking together, talking as if we belong. And I think that's the resistance that my partner previously felt when I was using philosophical jargon, is that you're talking to me, but you're talking to me in such a way that you're reminding me I don't belong. And the only way that I could think about out of that was go out of the way I belong into making her feel like she belongs. Because in some ways, I already have my space to use my jargon, my talking. But the other person doesn't. So yeah, I don't know. That's just what comes to mind when we're talking about belonging and talking. And I do really find it fascinating that Alex kind of exploited the IDW there and their resistance, because I'm really curious about that resistance. Like, why is it that that would be so insulting? Because fundamentally, they are communing about something. But I guess they really are in the know about what they're communing about, which is also, again, a really fascinating thing to me. Because to me, so long as we're talking, we're already communing about something, but it isn't really clear about what we're communing about. But we just need something to commune about. That's all that I know when we're talking. We're communing about something. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, I'll pass it to Jock, and I think I really appreciate the kind of, well, it's an act of love to shift your language. There's a kind of love in the ability to say this person, like I can say at work, like with the wholesale, like there would be unloving to not talk about football. It would be unloving to not talk about the daily life. Actually, it would be uninviting to do that kind of thing. I guess I would say I found that philosophy helped me see that not as deception or betrayal. Because you could say, well, you're being, because everyone tells you, be true to yourself. Be true to yourself. Don't start talking like that. But philosophy actually helped me go, no, talking different languages to different people is not a lie or a falsity. In fact, it's an act of love. And that would just be an example of where philosophy, like if you're going to have ideas, whether you like it or not, and you could easily be confused. I feel like I should shift my language, but maybe that's a false self and I'm lying, so I won't do that. And then because you don't know what to do, you end up creating alienation and making everyone feel like they don't belong. And then that's something that I think philosophy, when it's at its best, is helping you not do, where you see how what you're doing is not an act of hiding or fear. Because you could even say, well, actually, it's because you're afraid. You're afraid your girlfriend will reject you if you don't talk philosophy. So actually, you're afraid and you need to talk even more philosophically, right? I can always throw it back at you. I can always kind of make it spin, right? I just find without philosophy, I can't stop the spinning. Like I could always spin it and spin it and spin it and spin it and spin it. And then I'm probably going to alienate the person at the wholesale, or at the venue or different things, right? So that insight on language and belonging, I think is quite astute. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, to close out, I mean, so obviously, Alex, I appreciate, right, apparently, as you throw it out, I think you made a very clear contrast between the kind of modes of belonging, right, that Daniel talked and Michelle talked about in Belonging Again, versus other orientations, right? This kind of ideological negative as the context of identity, right? That it's a body is being, the corporate or intellectual body is being attacked from without, and then that causes a response reaction of identity, right? So that's what I heard from what you shared of basically anti-woke responsiveness, right? And you can go down the list. I mean, nationalism is literally 99% of the time, nationalism is almost always a response in war conflicts, one way or the other. So I think that's a very clear, I think it's very important because it's also what Daniel's pointing out, that kind of destructive, deconstructive mode of orientation. It works for identity. We know it works. The problem is we've concluded, as Daniel says, Michelle, and Belonging Again, we don't want to we don't accept the consequence of that mode of orientation of belonging. So then the question becomes, what is the other orientation? What's the constructive mode versus the deconstructive or negative orientation mode? I just want to point out, by the way, so beyond me even is admitting, part of the purpose of being here is to have friendship, right? And as Daniel said, that's the project here. What's the project? Friendship. That requires a certain orientation. So even really subtle things like Daniel summarizing what's being said by each person and giving it back to the group to understand. That's not an accident. That's an intentional act of trying to build belonging within the group, just as an example. Let alone even modalities of where I don't know about anybody else, but I have a notebook with me as I join these calls. there's so much information and model agitation going on. I need to write down, as Javier said, what attracts me, right? What draws out something surprising, something interesting, something in agreement or in conflict, one or the other. But I have to enter this space into a certain orientation of basically being given things, right? Kind of oriented to give. I think that's very different from an ideological shelter space, which is meant to be at best model confirmation. Isn't that one of the interesting differerences right there? A lot of spaces and a lot of interactions are about, tell me my model is mapping to reality. Please give me self-evidencing that my model is correct. A lot of spaces have that intention. That's also why, like, to challenge that it might be some other reason. It's a little more contingent that the content of the model don't matter that much, but the structure of the orientation is what matters. That's a really interesting point. And Alex is gone, but that was good. Anyways, I was now showing the rest of the group. So I just want to draw out, like, that's a very nuanced point about what's going on there. That's, I think, really interesting. And that requires a certain level of maturity. Just to point out. That's the thing, too. You know what marks maturity is, just to close on that note? That you get more pleasure in contribution than in receiving or taking. I find it's actually a very interesting heuristic I use in my life. One of the ways to pick out people and their level of maturity is their orientation to contribution. I think that's actually quite important. So I'll close with that. And like I said, and the fact that, Daniel, you had that literally the intention, by the way, of friendship being the orientation of this entire project. I think it's beautiful. So I'll close with that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jockin and Mr. Luber. We had a disagreement. It was perfect, and it was great. And alas, I have a hard stop here in a minute. But it was very good. And we were talking about basically the point of the net is friendship primarily, not like solving the world's problems or different things and so on and so forth. That there is that kind of pointless point that then requires a certain creating or courage that Michelle was talking about and things like that. And it is really, really hard to have conditions of friendship. Because let's say, so I always modeled it, I guess, when I think about the net as the Big T, the diner in Charlottesville, Virginia, where you never know who's going to come in. You sit down, the old guy, Mr. Dillard, Mr. Frey, Mr. Chapman, they're sitting and talking. You're always going to see them. You come and go and different things. Like, it has a diner structure. There's no preset plan. And how there's something very alive with that. Versus, say, communities where you say, well, we're going to talk about, we're here to have, let's say, a Bible study. Sometimes Bible studies can be so rigid and closed because there's a preset box, right? Or like a topic, we're going to get together and even read Aristotle or Hume. There can be something very rigid. I think what is so hard is creating conditions of relationship that do not suffer enclosure, that don't become enclosed. Because if they become enclosed, they are now susceptible to ideology, fascism, givenness, rigidity, closed-mindedness, and so on and so forth, right? All right. Well, if the correct conditions of friendship are more open, that they don't fall into that enclosure, then it has to have some kind of diner structure where people come and go. You don't know what people are going to say. But here's the other thing. It has to be regular. Like, every morning that's good. Glinda's there. Hudnall's there. Like, it's every morning. There has to be a regularity to it. So likewise, the net has to have a regularity to it. Otherwise, it can't have a diner thing. But the regularity is the consistency, not the topic. Because if you make the consistency a topic, it's going to become enclosed and it's going to alienate. And it's also going to then inevitably be about defending that enclosure. You're inevitably going to be about defending your project or defending your reading of whoever, right? So what you have to do is, in a way out, you have to have some kind of consistency. Otherwise, you can't have an orbit because it's chaos. But the tendency that tends to occur is people create consistency in terms of topic or subject. Well, then it falls into the correspondence and enclosure and ideology. You need to make a consistency of time, consistency of place, and consistency of exercise, not subject. So what is the exercise here? Philosophy. Kind of has to be, right? So it's not a subject, but it's a particular exercise or art, right? So there's enough consistency that people can come up with a sense of intelligibility, but not so much consistency that it leads to enclosure. I think this is what I would call the conditions of friendship that are the only way to deal with the problem of global pluralism. The reason why this is difficult, though, is because it's like you were saying, Jockin, friendship as such is only possible if the people who come into it have certain levels of capacity, maturity, emotional intelligence, so on and so forth. So in that sense, there's a kind of elitism, but the elitism is not that you have to have a certain resume to be here, but that you as an individual in your own personal life somehow, some way have gained said capacity. Maybe it's because you worked a blue collar job. Maybe it's because you were a story writer. Maybe because it's Uber. Who knows? It's not a kind of criteria that's based on you have a degree. It's a criteria of for some reason, one is able to enter into these spaces and not take things personally. They're able to not respond to diversity in a pathological way. In my experience, the probability of someone being like that correlates strangely strongly with philosophy. There is some weird correlation with the likelihood of a person being able to do that and they being the kind of person that have an interest in philosophy. But when I say that, it is not I'm a college degree major in philosophy. It's that philosophical way of life where they spent their childhood writing novels. Then they started a business, this creative, explorative, interested in ideas kind of person that is not easily, it's not just because they're a Hegel scholar or something. There's some sort of mode that seems associational. There's some sort of mode that the kind of people who have it tend to also be interested in philosophy. And they tend to have discussions that, here's the key, end up philosophical, not because they intended to be philosophical, but that's because that's how their mind works. Bottom-up philosophy, not top-down philosophy. It's organic, right? Because here's the other thing. I never personally go to any conversation ever saying, I'm going to make this philosophical. I find it happens. Like, it occurs. And also, I have no idea how you can have a conversation that is sustained in an intimate, deep way that doesn't end up in philosophy. Like think about small talk. Like everyone knows small talk. There's a lack of an intimacy in that, right? There's a kind of enclosure in that as well. There's a kind of alienation, you could even say, a kind of rigidness, right? How can a conversation not have those qualities of small talk and not somehow end up in philosophy? I think there's a way. It could be about football. It could be about a shared subject, right? You could say, well, it's about football. So you go into or you're all weightlifters. You go, okay, so it's a shared subject. Here's the issue. If it's a shared subject, you're falling back into the problems of totalitarianism, global exclusivity. This will not be the address of global pluralism. It cannot be, because it must be exclusionary to the people that share that given or that shared skill. So there's an exclusivity, right? So this will not work. So if we're talking about an address to global pluralism, it has to be a shared thing that is open enough to allow indifference, but not so open that it is chaos. And it has to feel intimate. It has to feel endless. It has to feel motivational. I don't know of anything other than philosophy that is like that. It seems like it has to be philosophical. And the key philosophy that does that is the philosophy of friendship. Not philosophy as subject of friendship, but the philosophy that characterizes friendship in this deep way, if it is not a friendship of a shared given. So there is a kind of way that friends interact with one another that is a sort of shared love of wisdom that gathers them under that, which is the wisdom that allows them to know each other more so, and that allows more intimacy. It is not the wisdom, the wisdom that you love in philosophy is not the wisdom of some mountaintop. It's the wisdom of intimacy that you find in friendship, and what you love is that intimacy that results from the philosophy you share in the friendship that makes those friendships have a deep that they otherwise could not. The love of wisdom that you have in philosophy reflects back on the relations of that philosophy to make them more intimate. And that is the wisdom, that intimate wisdom, that knowing of desire, that knowing of love, that is the love of wisdom that must manifest in friendship. And I think that is what you find. Those are the qualities I think that are needed for the address of a global pluralism. And it reminds me of the diner back at Big T. This has been a treat. Thank you all. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. You are all friends.